Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As today we want to return to the land of Israel and Palestine, which we've been covering over the last several months as events there in Israel in particular around the so-called judicial reform of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the right-wing government. But also the increasing tensions between the Israeli settlers and the Palestinians have continued to fester, and world attention has been galvanized on that area of the world. This is an important subject for all of us to pay attention to. And I want to just note that yesterday, May 15th, marked the 75th anniversary of the partition of Palestine in 1947. And that was the act of the United Nations. It was very small at that moment. It had been formed in the spring of 1945 by President Roosevelt as the Second World War was coming to a close. And one of the most momentous decisions that body made very early on was to partition Palestine, which at that moment was controlled by the British and the French. And so the British mandate called for partition, and that began 75 years of perpetual war in the Middle East between the Jewish people who had come into that part of the world, in particular since the carnage of the Holocaust and the Second World War, and the Palestinian people who had been there the entire time and saw no reason to make room for what was essentially a European problem. The anti-Semitism of Europe had given rise to the Holocaust, and rather than solve the problem in Europe, the Europeans, as colonizers, decided they would solve the problem somewhere else in the Middle East. And in the immediate aftermath of the partition, over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced as the Jewish forces, the Jewish armies began to consolidate control of certain areas of the land. And it's been referred to in Palestinian culture and tradition as the Nakba, the great catastrophe. And that was the origin moment of the refugees, the Palestinian refugees who have never been allowed back to the lands that they inhabited because of the imperative of the creation of the State of Israel, which was declared in May of 1948. So that's the subject that we're going to delve into today. And before we do that, let us breathe together, as we always do. For those of you who are new, in a moment you'll hear the sound of a bell. When you hear the bell, just breathe in very slowly for about 5.5 seconds. Then you'll hear the sound of another bell, and then breathe out. We're going to take 10 breaths together. Coherent, conscious breathing, just to gather ourselves in this world of escalating turbulence and chaos. Internal coherence and internal equilibrium is probably the most important thing that we can cultivate to ensure that we have what we need to navigate. And more importantly, I would say, as we contemplate an area of the world which has become a festering sore of division and hatred and sectarianism and racism, what Jalaluddin Rumi, the great Persian poet, said, I think is fundamentally true, and one of the reasons why we breathe. He said, I am neither a Jew nor a Christian, nor a Muslim, nor a Zoroastrian, or a Hindu, or a Buddhist. I'm a breath-breathing human being. And that's been forgotten in the Middle East. And for 75 years, there's been perpetual war and suffering on all sides, by all parties. So for us at Humanity Rising, just to remind ourselves every day that all we are, in the end, are breath-breathing beings. And that as we breathe, the universe breathes. And because the universe breathes, we breathe. So it's in that spirit I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising today, and let us take 10 breaths together as we begin our program. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Alison Carmel Ramer, who has been with us once before on Humanity Rising, talking about the situation in the Middle East, particularly among the Palestinians. She's a digital rights activist who's been over there for many, many years and currently finds herself in California. And when I discovered by talking to her father, John Ramer, which many of you know, that she was around and available, I just quickly contacted her. So thank you, Allison, for joining us today. And I thought we would start just by having you share your story. How did you first get sensitized about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and tell us about your journeys over there and what you've been doing, and just share with us your journey, and then we can get into some of the implications and some of the updates on current events.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me and for the introduction. I think also I really want to start the introduction by sharing also where I'm from and where my ancestors are from, as I am a part of their lineage. So my ancestors are primarily from Germany and Eastern Europe, Ukraine and Poland. But I have lived in the United States, and my family has lived in the United States for several generations now. We left because of the pogroms, which happened, were kind of a pre-Holocaust event that created a wave of immigration to the United States and to other countries around the world. So I have grown up on stolen land as a settler, in a sense, and also as a refugee, the child of refugees, and as a full citizen with equal rights. All at the same time, I grew up in the Duwamish and Snohomish lands, the ancestral lands in Seattle, Washington, and fed by the watersheds there. And then I spent 15 years in Palestine, and also with some time in Iraq, and have returned to California now, to the land of the Miwok and the Ohlone people. And I'm here now at a very difficult, challenging point in Israel-Palestine, but also more widely in the world. So I just kind of wanted to share a bit of the lineage that brought me. And then, being an American and growing up in the time of 9/11 and the beginning of the war on terror, this had a really big impact on how I would choose to live my life. And I think for many of us, the time of 9/11 was a time of great fear and change and understanding about the US's role in the world. And then the United States, as we all know, launched into the war on terror and blanketed this whole place in the Middle East, which included Afghanistan, which is not really a part of the Middle East. And the term Middle East itself, is a colonial term. So today people use other terms like Southeast and West Asia, Sawa, or the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa. But really we can speak, Afghanistan being separate, Iran being separate, but we can speak about the Arab world and kind of a lot, the US's interventions there, particularly in Iraq, but also the relationship with Israel that the United States has had for decades, in which Israel is the second largest recipient of US foreign military aid. So it makes what some people talk about, that Israel is like a 51st state of the United States. And while that's, that's going a bit far, I think that it is fair to, pay attention and recognize that the sentiment behind that is saying essentially that the relationship is so close between Israel and the United States, and on many different levels, economically, in particular economically and militarily. And of sharing of technology, which, as I spoke about a lot, probably in the last time I was on your show, I became an expert in the last 5 to 10 years about the use of technology in the military industrial complex, and then how Israel and the United States and corporations based in the United States have been benefiting from the occupation of Palestine and using that to develop technological weapons in violation of international human rights law and humanitarian law. Now I seem like I want to kind of lighten up the conversation a little bit, because we can get really intellectual in this conversation and really heavy. And I think most of the viewers probably know and are aware of this very heavy reality in which we actually all live in. And it's not just in Israel, Palestine, but particularly also if you're in the United States, if you're in Canada, if you're in Australia, and if you're in Israel. We are all still in a context of settler colonial states, and a lack of reparations, and a lack of a peace process, and a lack of keeping treaties, and a lot, so in many ways, I don't think Israel Palestine in the situation there is, it is different in regards to that it's a newer conflict, and the rights that Palestinians have is not like the rights that Native Americans have today. And the ongoing military assaults on their lives, and the continued efforts to really deconstruct their society, their culture, and their movement for liberation is reminiscent of a lot of what we've seen also in other settler colonial states. But it is different and very similar. I think it's important to hold that paradox and really like acknowledge both of those things.
Very good point.
Yeah. And our connectivity, you know, for me, how I got connected to this, well, like as I was saying, like I did grow up Jewish, but I think particularly, you know, it was the combination of being Jewish and American that, you know, when there started to be all these interventions in the Middle East and everyone was painted as being a terrorist and there are all these terrorists over there and they want to kill us. And I was like, well, like, hold on, like, I can't imagine really that that's everyone, you know, and I was a young person and I felt like, well, if that's really the situation, like, you know, like all these Israelis and all these Jews live there that are supposedly my family, supposedly my kin, and they're also there. So I felt that I wanted the opportunity to go deeper as a witness. And I'll really be honest with you that, you know, it's kind of also one of those things that feels bigger than me in some sense. I remember about 18 years ago now. It is exactly 18 years ago. Really feeling that, looking at myself and who I was in the world and what niche, you know, in this big ecosystem, like where do I belong? And really thinking that it was important to look at Israel and the relationship between the United States and Israel and my relationship to Israel as a young Jewish person. So as many of you also probably know, you know, Israel is really invested in what we call Hezbollah or propaganda. They have a ministry of information that's specifically focused on what's the image of Israel in the world, as many states do, certainly, but Israel is deeply invested in that project, as well as many Jewish philanthropists throughout the world who have invested their wealth into ensuring that people continue to support the state of Israel, and particularly including Israel's domination of Palestinians. And one of the ways that it's really important to do that is to keep a Jewish majority in Israel. So if you go on Wikipedia, like I did yesterday, and you just look up Israel and you're like, oh, okay, like what kind of government do they have there? I mean, they have it says they have a parliamentary democracy. But if you're like me and you got to have a lot of time like studying and like reading through the books and stuff, and actually you don't even have to do that because you can see Israel is really an ethnocracy. What does that mean? That really means that one ethnic group is dominating the other groups. And though Israel, you know, technically it seems like it's a democracy and that people have the chance to vote, there are huge swaths of the population that are controlled by Israel that don't have access to voting. And the people who do have access in certain communities are often denied. And, you know, there's very deliberate challenges put in place so that they won't be engaged in the electoral process. It's very important for Israel to keep something that they openly talk about. When I was in college, I would go to a Support Israel event, and it would be about something called the demographic dilemma. And the demographic dilemma is just essentially where we want to keep, you know, Israel wants to keep the majority of the population to be Jewish with an idea that they will continue to support Zionism and continue to support the state of Israel. So Zionism, I think it's important just to like put a pin here. And also, I just want to like step back for a minute and also just recognize that this is a place where we all have a lot of like heartstrings and emotions. You know, whether we're one of the 3 Abrahamic faiths that's connected to this land, whether we're US citizens, Israelis, Jews, Palestinians, you know, there's a lot of different people with a lot of emotions, experience, and deep connection to this place. And there's definitely certain words that we might use that can be really triggering and really painful to hear. And I think that Zionism is one of those words. So I just want to, say that like it's really important as you listen to this conversation to also just be aware of your body and be aware of like how hearing different things make you feel. And when you notice that like tightness, or you notice that immediate wanting to respond, or even the excitement and the support for something that's being said, I think that's really interesting and important for us, just to notice like where our composition, where we move when we're hearing these things. And that helps us to understand our own learning journeys, I think, and where we want to explore and how we can grow and develop ourselves in this conversation, which applies to so much wider how we deal and how we live in a world in which nationalism and racism and systematic oppression and the military-industrial complex are still dominating our lives. So I just wanted to like put that there for us to remember, that our emotional and spiritual and physical self is just as important as the intellectual aspects we're discussing today. So going back to Zionism, and for me personally with Zionism, the idea of having a safe place that Jewish people could go to where we were able to exercise one of our human rights that we all have, which is self-determination, and to have a state and a society. It's dreamy, it's something that seems like it could be an answer to the problems of racism, or as a lot of people talk more specifically about anti-Semitism, and it is and has been, because Zionism did manifest in the world as a real place. The state of Israel is a creation of Zionism, as well as a creation of the end of British colonialism, of the end of World War II, what to do with all of these refugees, right? Like it's a place where Europe also found a solution for somewhat of their problem, right? And the United States and others who wanted to have European influence in the Middle East, in a place where the Arab world was, and where they felt very intimidated and very wanting to have control. The Ashkenazi, the European Jews, were particularly felt that, with the creation of State of Israel, that a strong alliance could be built there that would support the diplomacy of those settler colonial Western states for a long time. And that has been the case. But I think on a more personal level, when we think about young people, when we think about today, or myself even, you are looking for a solution. People are looking for a solution, are looking for something on a smaller scale, a place where you feel that you could have some influence, where we could build a different type of society. But the truth is that Israel, unfortunately, it's from its founding and from the roots and from this Nakba, which we are discussing, the catastrophe that was created with the establishment of Israel. And then in 1967, with the Nakba, where Israel continued to take more land than was partitioned. And the fact that, it's really painful, to imagine, but, young people from Auschwitz who survived Auschwitz were then in Israel and given weapons and told to go and get rid of their enemies who were within, historic Palestine and the newly partitioned land. So very traumatized people creating more trauma. We know and we see that all over the world. This is nothing unique to being Israeli or Palestinian or Jewish or Muslim or Christian or that land. This is something human. I really believe that, and I really think it's important we remember that this is not an exceptional situation. It's exceptional that we continue to give so much attention. It is exceptional the amount of power that Israel has. Israel is a nuclear power, the only nuclear power in the Middle East. And the fact that a European, a group of European refugees have the only nuclear weapon in an entire region of people who have been there for generations, it shows us that the changes in power, how they so profoundly are disproportionate. So I don't think that we're dealing here also a situation with equal sides, right? Like, this isn't equal sides because Israelis have so much more power than the entire Arab world for generations. And so there never was a situation in which force could really be used to solve this. Not that force can at any point solve this, but I think, we want to think that we're dealing with two brothers, right? Or who are in a fight together, but this is not the case. One brother is super mighty and another brother, he's barely able to walk. So I think this is just an important framing. Back to my more personal story, so Zionism for me, I was looking for a solution, and a lot of the propaganda around Zionism historically has also been connected to socialism. And socialism and socialist democracy was also something that is a part of the Jewish lineage, particularly in Eastern Europe, and something that's just so, I see today how much we really wish for a society that is organized in a different and more equitable and just way. And so it was, I was coerced in a sense, by that dream and by that hope, and curious about it. And I immigrated to Israel as a young person while I was still in the university. And, I really wanted to immerse myself in Israeli culture. I felt it was very important because actually I didn't know any North Americans at that time who spoke Hebrew and Arabic. You could, and who could really have a wider cast view of what was going on, but not be Israeli or not be Palestinian. So I felt it was very important first to kind of immerse myself and to understand the perspective of Israelis and my own connection to that, so I could be self-conscious as I was going about this work as a Jewish person. So, the first few years are just a deep dive into culture, into knowing people. A lot of time really spent between Tel Aviv, but also Jerusalem. And slowly, as I became more fluent in the language, I started to recognize that there was such a discrepancy between what was said in Hebrew, particularly in the news, for example, and specifically during one of the first wars that I was there for in 2008. This was actually the second war I was there for, but 2008, the Gaza War. It was the first of the Gaza wars, as we call them, where Israel banned all journalists from coming to Gaza to report on the war, and called up everybody in Israel who is in the reserves, not only the active duty soldiers, but those in the reserves. And it creates a very tense and dramatic experience. The whole city full of soldiers suddenly in Tel Aviv, the place that's supposed to be the bubble, that's supposed to be this different cosmopolitan space. I mean, it completely gets eroded when you have this level of military engagement. And meanwhile, while they're calling up all these soldiers and creating all these crying mothers and this tension and this fear, right, in the society, most soldiers are not even going into Gaza. Though there were at that time ground ground invasion into Gaza, a lot of this work still is being done, and even much more so today, by drones, by planes, in the sky. And we still see, and we saw it this week, the Israeli leadership saying that, oh, thank goodness we've come to a peace agreement now between Islamic Jihad and Israel, and our soldiers can come home. Their soldiers never went anywhere during that war, this last week. So we see just the drama, right? The drama, the need, and using Hebrew is really a way also of controlling a population, because a lot of those people, while plenty of Israelis do speak English, still the primary way that they're getting news and information is in the Hebrew language and through Israeli media, which also is very concentrated and controlled in a lot of ways. So when I started to see this big discrepancy, and also know that, if any of you took a politics 101 class, that, or studied a little bit about terrorism, right? It's like the environment that are created in the environment. No jobs, no freedom of movement, no access to food and water and resources. These are the reasons that you end up with people who decide to become what we have labeled as terrorists, but who are using, I think it's more appropriate to say, who decide to use armed resistance to address the material issues
Very
that
good point.
they're struggling with. So the conditions for that are in Gaza, 100%. Gaza is completely locked between Egypt and Israel. Egypt, who is the #1 recipient of US military aid, or has been historically. I haven't checked lately because I'm on a bit of a sabbatical right now in the past year, but regardless. So, it's a man-made disaster. This whole situation is created because of a political will to create a situation in which there is insecurity, to justify the need for further technologies, for further use of those technologies, and to be able to show, that they have been used successfully, and to sell them to increasing numbers of states around the world that are very interested in how to control populations that they would like to disregard. So back to the personal realm again. When the Gaza war started to happen and I started to see this difference, I said, okay, I think it's time that I'm going to move a little bit out of being so deeply in the Israeli culture and connected to the Israeli psyche, and I want to move to a more neutral space and start to explore more what is happening from the perspective of Palestinians. So for some time, I was working as a journalist, and I had the opportunity very quickly to go to see a demonstration that was happening in the West Bank, where a village had their freshwater spring taken over by Israeli settlers. And they had made like one demonstration where they had come down to the spring and really tried to, we're trying to reclaim the spring. But of course, the Israeli military came and protected the soldiers, and it turned into what we call, a clash situation where there was a lot of physical violence. And then the military started to suppress the village, and the village started to organize weekly demonstrations to travel from the village center down to their spring and try to reclaim it. So this actually continued for a decade, those demonstrations. And when I first showed up there, it was the second time they were doing it. And And, I showed up really honestly. I was a young person. I think I was like, I don't know, maybe 2011. So I don't know, I'm 22, 23, something like this. And I just walked up to a Palestinian person the first time, and I was like, hi, I'm an Israeli American Jew. I'm here to like understand better what's going on. Tell me whatever you think I need to hear. And at the time, I just wrote it down, but it played such a big role in my life. The human rights defender and leader Bassem Tamimi in the village of Nabi Saleh told me, you're the most important person who came here today because you came to remove the occupation, the military occupation from your mind. And yeah. And actually it was that conversation that also sparked a series of dreams for me, where my mind started to try and work out and understand, was it really the Israelis who were keeping me safe? As I decided to spend a month there, really in that neutral, trying to hold that kind of impossible neutral space, but really just listening, wanting to listen to everyone. And I took one weekend to be with the Palestinians and one weekend to be with the Israeli soldiers and one weekend to be with the Israeli settlers and to listen to what everyone had to say.
Wow.
And yeah, I came to the conclusion that the Israeli soldiers were provoking the violence. They were coming into the village and saying they wanted to keep the peace, but they started shooting at people while it was peaceful. And the Israeli settlers were trying to convince me that this freshwater spring, that they rehabilitated it and that there was no water there before they did the work on it. And when you looked at it physically, it was clear that this was just not the case. So it was clear to me that they were lying. And when you spoke with the Palestinians who had, are coming out of their own experience and struggling to internationally, this village, right? These are villagers, not people in cities, not people in diplomacy, but poor people, really. I mean, people with families of 6 that live on $500 a month max. They're like from Falahin, from the farming community. They really just didn't know how to communicate what was happening to the international audience. That was a challenge at the time. So with all of their welcoming hospitality that people in the Arab world are famous for, I was really afraid, actually, in the beginning. I was under the impression before, when I went to the West Bank, first of all, that everyone would want to kill me. If I was Jewish and Israeli and American, I would be just eaten up. And, I'm a perfect person to be kidnapped. And, this story was really told to me and people begged me not to go there. But when I went there, I found myself really with a true sense of not just this amazing hospitality, where Palestinians will tell you, the problem is not you as an individual. The problem, I have no problem with Jews. I don't even have, people will say, if you weren't in the army, if you weren't in the military, I don't have a problem with you being here in this land. The problem is that I don't have my rights and that your governments are suppressing and destroying our lives. So it's really clear for people on a people to people level that this is not the problem. The problem is not actually, at least when you're speaking to Palestinians from their perspective, it's not about being Jewish or being even Israeli. It's really about what you've done in your life and what the government is doing to their people. So I decided to support them more deeply, and I also felt that journalism was just too much of a the way that journalism was being done, with this idea that it's you should be unbiased, that didn't seem appropriate for me. So I decided to support them in more of their communications with the world. And it was a time where we didn't have smartphones yet. So bringing in digital cameras and being able to record the violence that was happening in the village was a big part of what I was trying to support, as well as connecting the village with people who had more power, diplomats, journalists, heads of humanitarian organizations, and creating a tour kind of where people would come and learn about the village. And the people in that village were so steadfast. It only took a small group of really committed people who were willing to sacrifice their safety, their sanity, their homes, and their lives, but they created a global movement. And you can see, like, when I started working with Nabi Saleh, you wouldn't find anything in the internet about this village, and I will drop the name in the chat. But now it was all over. It was all over the world, on the front of the New York Times Magazine. That village and those people, and I've seen how people who are oppressed can access power and can have their voice reach the people in power, but the political will to create those changes, the way that things seem to be interlocked, how difficult, how strong a hold economics plays in politics, makes it very, very challenging for there to be any type of response or change that is sufficient for the levels of injustice that we see. So anyways, my journey in Palestine continued. I worked with several villages, particularly children. We trained children, and very unfortunately, Israel targets children very often. Actually, Israel has more children in prison than any other country in the world, and targets children because it's a way of breaking the society. The majority of boys in particular will have already been in Israeli military prison, where 99% of people never go to trial, but can be held indefinitely for several years. And this is a military court. So if an Israeli settler boy and a Palestinian boy who live right next to each other in the West Bank end up in a fight, the Palestinian boy will go to military prison and most likely will never go to trial, but will spend years in prison. And the Israeli boy will go to a civil court where he'll be tried as a juvenile and enter a civil judicial and I don't know, in an incarceration system, which is very different. The access to so many things is so vastly different for these two people. So there's such a lack of equal rights between them that I think is really important to recognize. So yeah, that's a little bit about my story. And
what an extraordinary life you've had, Allison. I mean, and your perspicuity of mind at an early age to become aware of the contradictions and the nuances as you've told them is quite impressive. So I just want to acknowledge your life and your sensitivities and your courage as a Jewish young woman to go both to Israel and then down into Palestine and speak truth to power in such a skillful way. I just want to thank you for who you are, and you exemplify humanity rising in every sense of that term. So thank you.
Yeah.
And what's striking to me as someone who actually spent his junior year abroad at the University of Tel Aviv in the 1970s, and lived there for a year in the Jewish program at the Tel Aviv University right before the October War of 1973, is the striking similarities between Israel and the United States. I mean, and that's the area I'd like to probe next with you, because when you, as has happened in the United States, when you put the primary value on ethnicity, Jews in Israel, white people in the United States, you immediately create a universe of coercive subordination. And the challenges now in the United States, as the white population, like in Israel, the Jewish population teeters on the brink of minority status. What you see in Israel and what you're seeing in the United States is a mirror image of each other. If you look at what the Republican Party, like the Likud, is doing around demographics and foreigners and anybody of color and young people, they're doing everything they can to suppress that demographic, because their sole motivation is to preserve the white majority status and the Christian religion. And so understanding Israel is to understand the United States, and vice versa. And in fact, in the Republican Party now, they have the great displacement theory. They say explicitly on TV and in their ads that we've got to be, we white people, the more of those colored people that come into the United States through the border or any other means are going to displace white people. And that's what we have to protect by every means possible. So it's within that context that you've got the same, again, parallelism between this so-called judicial reform in Israel and this ongoing coup in the United States to not only suppress the vote and distort the electoral process, but as we saw with Donald Trump, actually to take over the government and make sure that the right kind of democracy that protects the Caucasian race is preserved in perpetuity. So thank you for setting that foundational understanding, because I think once that is understood, everything else becomes understandable in a coherent way. And so tell us a little bit more about anything you want to add to what I just said, but also your understanding of the judicial reforms and what's now going on in the Israeli side to ensure the perpetuation of this settler colonizing state that has been around for 75 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's good to remember just, that this has, in a sense, there has been a change in what the right wing, where the right wing is throughout time, both in the United States and in Israel and across the world. We see the right wing like moving more right, being more authoritarian. Like in the 1970s, the right wing in Israel, the Likud party, is actually the one that passed the basic laws, which Israel doesn't have a constitution, but the basic laws has functioned as a type of constitution in Israel. And the basic laws include like a lot of really beautiful human rights stuff. So it isn't always a recipe that the right wing is going to, bring a violation of human rights to us. But what we've seen now is just how far the right wing is, and them aligning themselves with a very anti human rights agenda, a complete disregard for the international system. And Israel is not alone in that. And many of the international relationships that Israel has been fostering in the Arab world, with the Emirates, with Morocco, Morocco is also a place in which they are actively occupying Western Sahara. And there's a lot of political alignment and a desire, along with the United States, which never joined the International Criminal Court, which has, continues to do its diplomacy in a way in which it won't be touched, in which it won't have to, engage with the war crimes that it's committing in the world, and whose diplomacy is really, their diplomacy is really designed to keep those states safe, but in a way in which it's really, it's not a current safety. Even if a war crime happened decades ago, the United States has designed a way in which it can operate in the world, along with Israel and other countries who are working to have that, where it doesn't have consequence for them, not the current human rights violations and not the ones that they have done decades ago. I'm just seeing some of these questions and they're just so lovely. Like, what does the Torah say? And yeah, and I actually have been studying that more lately, but anyways, I got distracted by these great questions. Where were we?
The judicial reforms.
The judicial reform. So yeah, so specifically, but for a while now, and the settler movement, right? The settler movement has been growing and growing, since 1967, but even before, there were aspirations to take over the West Bank. And the idea, for those of us who don't know, like, what is this judicial reform about? It's about overhauling the justice system, and reducing the Supreme Court's power. Very similar, as Jim was saying, like very similar to a lot of the efforts of Trump in the United States. And I get that Israeli society is really at a is really feel certain parts of Israeli society, particularly the left, who for decades really hasn't been able to effectively organize itself and respond even to this continued advances on the right of suppressing more and more human rights, not only of Palestinians, but also of women, of Palestinians who live in Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? And yeah, we can see that, this now, but now the tension is rising. It's more on the surface than it's been in decades. And there is, for a long time, a really big fear within Israeli society about the big sectarianism that already exists there, right? Between secular people and religious people, between what Israelis call Mizrahim, which are historically Arab Jews, and Ashkenazim. And there's many, and Israel as a settler state also has, just like the United States, big groups of people who've immigrated. There's a really large Russian population there who came with their politics. They're very right-wing politics. They're very kind of more authoritarian kind of support that has impacted what we see as the makeup of the politics in Israel. But I think also we really have to recognize that this is it just takes generations to create this kind of atmosphere. And since the Oslo Accords, okay, what happened at the Oslo Accords, and you could really do a whole show on Oslo Accords, and I could give you a list of great people to talk about it. That is something really important, I think, that we understand in the United States and in the West in general. We think about the time of Oslo, oh, we were so close to having peace, but when you dig a little bit deeper, that's not really the case. What was going on there was the creation of something called economic peace. And the economic peace was the idea that if we can basically break down the Palestinian economy and make it so dependent on Israel that Israel will turn these terrorists into consumers. And then it'll be a population that is more beneficial to the state of Israel. And the Oslo Accords were designed in many ways to make the Palestinians feel that they have a state, while actually they don't have nor sovereignty on their borders, no sovereignty when it comes to their economic system. And and this time, that time of Oslo and the time of the policies of economic peace in recent years has shifted. And it shifted to something that's called the policy of shrinking the conflict. And this was actually a centrist policy where the idea was like, okay, it's actually bad for Israel to we're trying to have this be a place for tourism. We're trying to show that we're democratic in the world. And, it doesn't look good to have all this conflict. Maybe we can do some things to just ease the tension and Palestinians won't resist so much. Let's give them more jobs in our economy. Let's give them more chances to just, to go out and to visit Israel, but to not live there. Let's just make things a little bit easier so that they'll stop demanding their rights so much. And this is a really clear policy, and it's written and it has lots of descriptions and details about what to do. But actually, the people who are in power now in the latest government is more right than that, and they're not on board with that. They actually, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's one of these right-wing leaders, and he is now, I think he's a minister of security. Yeah. So he's moved into a very powerful position. He's a settler who is known and convicted of being racist and really violent. And I'll be honest that I didn't spend so much time to go. It's hard for me to go even, into the details of each of these players in the Israeli situation right now, because it's just it's so sad to see how. But back to Oslo, right, and this atmosphere that got created, the European Union at the time of Oslo really decided to control Palestinian textbooks. That was a part of the deal. We're going to look at your textbooks and make sure that there's not anything racist in here. But the same deal did not happen for the Israelis. The Israelis continue to have, and their textbooks are full of super racist propaganda about Arabs. And so, the seeds of division, right? It takes generations to have a population that's so afraid, that's so racist. And they really believe that, things that an answer to their problem is to get rid of Palestinian people, which they don't believe even exist. And you can get in a whole conversation about that, but let's we don't need to go there now. So anyways, I think that part of the challenge was talking about this judicial reform is thinking that there was a democracy there before. There wasn't. This has always been an ethnocracy, and this is an apartheid situation. This is a situation where not only do 6 million people not have the right to vote and are controlled by a military with no rights, but the people who do, the Palestinians who live within Israel and have citizenship and supposed to have equal rights, do not. And it is documented again and again how they are treated as second-class citizens, which, in some ways is similar to what you see in the United States. But the situation within Israel of one of apartheid and one of ethnocracy is really what's going on. And I know that that's, so difficult and hard for Israelis to recognize that they already don't live in a democracy. And for Jews, I can just see the pain that people are going through in the United States with the situation in Israel. And I just feel like we have to really recognize that already wasn't there. It's already not there. And yes, these advances now, with Itamar Ben-Gvir getting approval to have a private military. I mean, this is when we really start to see the red flags, right? The red flags really come up when
Absolutely.
the relationship between military and racist government people.
So your view, Allison, is that democracy has been sort of a chimera all along in an centric state, an apartheid state. And therefore, what's happening with the judicial reforms, as they're being called, is really an extension of the same logic that has been accumulating in Israeli society since creation, as it were, because
Perfect.
of the.
Yeah. Sorry, just you reminded me the perfect example. Okay, so back to that little village, right? That little village, Nebi Saleh, that I was talking about. So they had a big swath of land that settlers came and settled on in the 1970s. They had all the papers, they went all the way to the Supreme Court level. The Supreme Court said, you need to leave. The settlers are not allowed to be here. And the military protected the settlers to stay. That was in the 1970s until today. So that has already been going on for decades. And now it's just that this is, in the front and in the face and as a part of the conversation in a different way. But on the ground, you've seen that the military does not listen to the Supreme Court for decades.
Yeah, and it's an extraordinary thing. It's like Trump in the United States. A lot of the racism, sexism, xenophobia, as long as it wasn't spoken, as long as it wasn't officially declared, people would somehow abide by it, like you were saying in the 1970s. And what's happening in both countries now is the things that should never be said are now official, explicit policy, and the ultimate consequences of those policies are now being implemented, and everybody's freaking out because they're being forced to publicly, consciously recognize that democracy has never been there in the first place. Would that be what you're essentially saying?
Yeah, and I think they're seeing more of the impact like on the local level.
Yeah.
Like, just speaking with my friends who are living there, there's so many services that are really being shut down right now. She was sharing with me a lot about what's happening in the mental health field, but like the way that budgets are being allocated, I mean, so much more money going to government, continue, keeping it within, not having that money going to people. And the situation for Jewish Ashkenazi Israelis is intensifying. There has been 25% decrease in the amount of jobs. Large amounts of the people who are in this tech world that there has been a lot of layoffs as well. So we're going to see, like, as the material resources are constricting, which we know that's what the next 50 to 100 years looks like. We're dealing with real constriction of resources, of water, and already in Israel, Palestine, it's already about the land. That people are going to be looking to their governments to be supporting them more in this time. And at the same time, this government is pulling back from what they provide people. So.
Well, let me ask you, let's turn the tide, as it were, and based on your experience, Allison, what's the pathway out? And there's obviously two pieces of this. One is on the Israeli side, but also then on the Israeli-Palestinian side. I guess there's a third, and then the Palestinians. But I mean, since you've been so deeply immersed in the shadow side, I would say, you probably have a really good sense that if you were prime minister for a day, as it were, how would you begin the process? Let's start with revitalizing Israeli democracy. And I know they're all
a lot of people.
Okay,
well, I'm going to answer this question in a way that's like, I'm going to acknowledge that that's a very challenging question, which I get asked. Yeah. And my answer to it is not necessarily an answer that it can be difficult for people. But I'll be really honest with you that I want to just say that this isn't where a lot of my work has been focused, because this isn't the situation. We're not going to end up with a situation where I'm the prime minister, or really anyone who thinks like me. It's very hypothetical, and
although it would probably be a good idea under the circumstances.
Also being a woman, I mean, very unlikely, right? Super unlikely. No, but I mean, really, the first day I'm prime minister, I really don't think that. I don't think that the state of Israel, as it is designed, like I don't think that it should exist. So I would actually work to dismantle the state apparatus, and I would work to I would create immediately the opportunity for Palestinian refugees to come back. I would support Palestinians and Israelis through a truth and reconciliation kind of process, through a process of reparations, through land redistribution, and the creation of a binational state. I don't think that it's up to me, or should be up to me, as someone who is a North American, as someone who is an Ashkenazi and European lineage, to decide how the lives of an indigenous population in Palestine. And that's controversial, right? Like, people get really it's intense when I talk about, I think, for people, that I see Palestinians as indigenous and I don't see Jews as indigenous. And there's different theories about that, right? Like, when are you native? Like, that's such a question. Like, people, I meet people in Seattle, and somebody of Swedish ancestry will walk up to me and be like, "Oh yeah, I'm a native from Seattle." I'm like, "Are you?" I don't think so. But right, you're born in a place, your family has lived in several generations in this place. You have a deep connection to the land and to the culture there. I don't think we really have an appropriate way right now of really sharing that, but I think it is different, and we need to recognize that, yes, there were Jews who were living, Arab, Palestinian Jews who were living in Israel for many generations consecutively, right? The Ashkenazi Jews, it's generations, hundreds of years, if not more than that, living in Eastern Europe. And it's even controversial whether or not we ever were in Palestine, or whether we were a part of mass conversions that were happening in Europe. So I don't think that it's appropriate to really, say that I have equal rights to Palestine as someone whose grandparents are buried there in the ground, whose house that their great-grandparents built still stands, the olive trees that they put in the ground, that they eat them. That is not the same. And I think it's really important that those people have the chance that they were promised to have a sovereign state, whatever it's going to look like. It's not my business, it's really theirs. And it's sad the way humanity works, right? It's sad, we're oppressed and we oppress others, and that cycle continues. And I wish, all my prayers that cycle will not continue further. But also for me personally, and for Ashkenazi Jews, for North American Jews, this is not our decision. This is ours to support the reparations and the money that is needed for them to rebuild, and for them to deal with what is now a very different state and a very different place than they ever imagined having. They will say to you again and again, we have no problem if refugees were to show up here. So many people, Palestinians, will tell you, we would welcome them, but we wanted them to be a part of our society. We wanted them to join us in what it is to be Palestinian, not to come and dispossess us and try to rid us of our culture. So yeah, that's what I would do.
Well, I think I would essentially agree. I mean, I think, if one used what happened in Europe as a model after the Second World War with the Steel and Coal Commission that Jean Monnet, the French diplomat, proposed that allowed former enemies to become friends and now has become the EU. If you just think that if Israel and the Palestinians would form a greater union and make the borders porous and engage in mutual both autonomy, but also interactivity, the whole situation would be diffused in I think in very short order. And that's always been my view, is that why, I mean, it's so small, you can drive across the whole place, in a couple of hours. Why not just unite as a single complexio of, it'd obviously be complex and, with the settlers and all of that. But a common market would be a good place to start toward the goal that I think you're setting out. But then that requires, a complete change of consciousness. And that I'd like to go back to sort of your.
Well, and also just like materially, just, that point, and then we can go back, like, also the United States has really supported this, and enabled this.
Of
So
course.
I mean, severing that relationship or the way of that relationship being more conditioned based on the need for human rights, I think is essential.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And I'd like to take you up on this question of trauma, just to get your sense of how you would, because I remember when I was there in 1971, 72 or 72, 73, I can't even remember now. There was headlines of a young man, or actually he was I think a colonel at that time. He had been in one of the concentration camps, and he gave an interview that made the headlines. He says, during the Second World War, I had nightmares of crouching on the floor and the German boot, kicking me to death, and I'd wake up in this spasm. He said, I've been in Israel now for 20 years, 25 years. I'm in the military, and now I'm having the same nightmares again. But now I'm the guy with the boot, and I'm kicking the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And that caused a huge discussion, certainly in our American program, because we were all kind of astonished. But it really gave truth to the point that you were making earlier about that this is just trauma. And there are many places around the world where there's ethnic rivalries and so forth and so on. And one of the great tragedies of the Middle Eastern one is that the very people who suffered the greatest oppression in the Second World War became the oppressors when they were liberated from that situation and went into another situation in which the roles were reversed. And of course, Thomas Hubel and many people talk about transgenerational trauma. But I think that continues to live out in increasingly insidious ways, because the more traumatized one is, the more constrained your scope is for redemption, healing, and creativity. So how does that play out in your worldview, given the fact that we've got to find some solution at some point, or the situation will become completely untenable, because you'd have a complete fascist state on the one hand and a state of complete deprivation on the other hand, and that can't end up anywhere other than self-destruction.
I mean, I think we're on those lines. I mean, it's a completely untenable situation for people in Gaza, and I really can't say it's a tenable situation for people in the West Bank. Most people are leaving. If they could, in any way they can. I mean, if younger generations are really, finding it really hard to have a life there, and So I think it's already there. And I mean, part of my, there's lots of different ways in which, and certainly not enough ways, but there are ways in which, people are working to address and deal with the trauma, and different sides. It's very interesting since I've been here in California, and part of the reason of coming here is to be in a space where people are really interested in healing and, and looking at all these different modalities for that and practicing that. And, I know that also, there's a spectrum about that, and like how much is this, what's really effective. We do know that it takes several generations for trauma to work itself out. In my mind, there's no question that I went halfway around the world, because actually the past 4 generations, all my ancestors did that. My father and mother moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. And before that, they moved, from Europe to the United States. And there's something within me that, tells me to make these big moves, and that is responding to the trauma of my ancestors and looking for a home and not feeling that the United States is safe enough. And that is part of the work that we have now. We have more understanding of how psychology, how our brains work, how trauma is passed, our genetics and our DNA than we ever had in human history right now. So I think that, that information is getting to a lot of us, and people are digging into like what it is on a personal level for them to heal, and doing that in ways that are potentially more successful than other ways. A lot of people are looking to, and it's really interesting to talk to some of my Israeli friends about healing for them, because since I came back to the United States, I really felt I needed to reconnect with Jewish community. It was really important for me. I was away from that community for more than a decade because it was so painful the way that Judaism was used in the context of Zionism. And I never felt that I can really find a Jewish community in Israel, because we are, in the process of supporting such a terrible situation there by living there and by being there, while some people see living there and being there as something that God has created an opportunity for. And I won't deny that, yes, like God has created this opportunity. I don't think I have a right to that, and it is like a choice in how I'm going to be in that situation. So coming back to North America was a way that I could have an opportunity to connect more, connect more with Judaism as a space for healing, because it is a part of my ancestral lineage.
Sure.
And for Israelis, Judaism is, my secular Israeli friends, Judaism is not accessible to them. Like, it is something that is very oppressive. It is something that has been very, it is still very connected, not only to Zionism, but to patriarchy and to a lot of things that are not a healthy way to heal. While in the United States, Judaism has gone through somewhat of a transformation, and you have different movements within Judaism that are more accessible. So they're going to other cultures, and they're going to other, and without a lens and without an understanding that that's also cultural appropriation. So, we are citizens of the world. We're all connected in some super organism kind of way. I understand that, and I think we have so much to learn from different traditions. And I also think that it's important to be within our traditions. And so for me personally, I've been able to turn towards Judaism for some of that, but access, I want to just say, I don't know what time it is, but access healing is such an important thing. This is what I feel I'm really passionate about, to be honest with you, Jim, these days, because, I really, continued and supported the development of several human rights organizations, Palestinian organizations, international organizations. I saw what happens to activists and what happened to myself from doing that work for so long, right? We all know about burnout and how that impacts long-term activists. We also know that some of the most at-risk people, in the world, like aside from their health issues and stuff, but they're like environmental and human rights activists are really targeted by governments along with journalists. And I really think that there needs to be more opportunities for, if we keep using the tools that have been created by such toxic ideology. In human rights, you do strategic planning to develop your organization, and strategic planning comes straight out of military thinking. There's so much military processes that are used in humanitarian development and human rights work. And I don't think that those are the tools that'll really take us to a place where we can transform this. And I'm just, I'm open. And that's kind of part of why I'm here in this community, right, with you, is like, I also really want to learn and know and understand and think about different ways in which we can do this work, different ways in which we are humanity rising that isn't also, that, I don't know, just that is a more sustainable way of being in the world for the people who are working to create that and the ones that they're creating it with.
Allison, you are amazing. This has been an extraordinary session. You're very deeply wise, my friend. And I just want to thank you for not only your courage, but your deep passion and your willingness to go into some of the deeper levels and layers of history, ethnicity, culture, spirituality, and religion that have rent us asunder. And in your own process, in your own life, you're seeking to bring them together in a very deep and inspiring way. So I just want to thank you for being who you are as a young person, because your generation is the light of the world. Your generation is the future of the world, and to have people of your quality is deeply inspiring to me as an elder and as someone with my own children, just to see how that spark of humanity rising burns so brightly in your soul. And so I just want to thank you for being with us today. Is there any final words you'd like to share with our global community before we close?
Yeah, I guess, like you said, Jim, I think it's something that I find I just want to continually share. It's just a reminder of of needing to be also like in this emotional space, of needing to be in the healing space. When we hear or when we're interacting with different aspects of what's happening in Israel, Palestine, or more widely, just how important it is for us to do that on an individual level, but also for us to have a collective support and engagement. And it does make a difference, your money. It does make a difference, your time. It does make a difference. Like, we are in a material situation, so the resources that you can provide to help people who are struggling to create human rights, and doing it for yourself, and acknowledging and giving that love and appreciation to yourself, if you're one of those people, I think it's just something I really that really resonates with me these days, in this time of change. And I just wish all of us a thank you for being here. And I wish us a good rest of our days and time here.
Thank you so much, Allison. Allison is Humanity Rising, everyone. So we've been graced today and richly blessed. That'll bring us to a close for our session today. You're all welcome to the after session chat. Allison, I know people would love to have you join the after chat.
Oh yeah. I would love to join the after chat.
For a few minutes. You'll see the link that Stan's just put into the chat, and then we'll see everybody tomorrow. We're going to begin a 3-day program on climate change in the Amazon. So we're going to go from Israel, Palestine to the Amazon tomorrow and listen to Rob DeLay and some colleagues talking about how that great, vast rainforest can not only be saved, but in saving the Amazon can save the global ecology for us all. So thank you, everyone. Allison, fantastic. And we'll see everybody tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Bye for now.